That night changed everything in ways I never could have imagined. It all began with a harmless office holiday party, just drinks, laughs, and a chance to unwind after a long year. Nothing unusual, right? But looking back, I realized that was the moment where boundaries blurred, trust shattered, and my life spiraled out of control. If you think you know where this is going, trust me, you don't. Make sure to watch until the end, because this story only gets crazier. The party was already in full swing by the time I arrived. Music blasted from the speakers, people clinked glasses, and the usually stiff office atmosphere had been replaced with something looser, almost electric. I'd been looking forward to it, a chance to escape the monotony of work and, frankly, my own life. I'm Emily, by the way. 32, married to Todd, and, up until a few months ago, I thought my life was fine. Not perfect, but fine. Todd and I had been in a rut. He was distant, glued to his phone most nights, and I felt more like a roommate than a wife. But I never thought I'd be the one to cross a line. Enter Jake, my boss. Jake wasn't just any boss, he was the kind of guy who made you laugh even when you didn't want to. Tall, confident, with that annoying but charming grin that made you forget he could fire you with a snap of his fingers. I'd always seen him as untouchable, someone who thrived on power but kept it professional. At least, that's what I thought. The first hour was harmless enough. I mingled with coworkers, sipped on a glass of wine, and tried not to think about the pile of laundry waiting for me at home. Then Jake showed up. The energy shifted the moment he walked in. He had this way of commanding attention without saying a word. People gravitated toward him, laughing a little louder, standing a little straighter. And then his eyes landed on me. "You clean up nice, Emily," he said, holding my gaze a little too long. I laughed it off, brushing away the sudden flush of heat in my cheeks. He was my boss, after all. Compliments were just part of his charm, right? As the night wore on, things started to feel different. Jake kept finding reasons to talk to me, his compliments growing bolder. "You've got this spark about you," he said at one point, leaning in closer than necessary. "I don't know how Todd lets you out of his sight." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. The wine wasn't helping my judgment, but something about his tone set off alarm bells. Still, I stayed. By midnight, most of the crowd had left or was too drunk to notice much of anything. That's when Jake pulled me aside, his hand lightly brushing my arm. "Can we talk for a second?" he asked, his voice low. I followed him to a quieter corner, thinking he wanted to discuss work or maybe wrap up the night. Instead, he said something that made my stomach drop. "You're different, Emily. There's something about you that I can't ignore anymore." "Jake, I think you've had too much to drink," I said, trying to laugh it off. He didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Meet me upstairs." 5 minutes. My heart raced. I froze, caught between disbelief and curiosity. What was he thinking? What was I thinking? If you're wondering what happened next, trust me, it only gets more intense from here. Don't go anywhere, because the choices I made after that moment changed everything. I stood there, frozen, Jake's words echoing in my mind, "Meet me upstairs." 5 minutes. My drink felt heavy in my hand, and the laughter from the party around me sounded distant, muffled. This couldn't be real. Jake wasn't serious, was he? I glanced around, hoping to catch someone's eye, some signal that I wasn't alone in this moment. But no one noticed. Everyone was lost in their own conversations, oblivious to the storm brewing in my head. A million thoughts raced through my mind. I thought about Todd, sitting at home in his usual spot on the couch, scrolling through his phone like he always did. I thought about the way he barely looked at me anymore, the silence that filled our house like a heavy fog. And then I thought about Jake, his confidence, the way he made me feel noticed in a way I hadn't felt in years. I should have walked away right then and there. I should have laughed off his comment and gone home. But instead, I lingered. 5 minutes turned into 10, and I told myself I wasn't going. I'll finish my drink, thank Sarah for the party, and leave. That was the plan. But my feet had a mind of their own. Before I knew it, I was standing at the bottom of the staircase, staring up at the hallway where Jake had disappeared. I don't know what I was expecting, a rational conversation? An apology for being inappropriate? Part of me thought he'd laugh it off, call it a joke. But deep down, I knew better. The hallway was dim, the sound of the party fading as I climbed the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the weight of every step. When I reached the top, I saw a single door slightly ajar, light spilling out into the hallway. I paused. This was my moment to turn back, to walk away and pretend none of this had ever happened. I took a shaky breath, my hand hovering over the doorframe. Jake? I called out softly. He was standing by the window, his back to me, a drink in his hand. When he turned around, that signature smirk was plastered on his face. You came, he said simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I shouldn't be here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But you are, he replied, taking a step closer. And that says more than anything you could tell me. I felt trapped, like the air in the room had thickened, making it hard to breathe. Jake didn't touch me, not yet, but his presence was overwhelming. This is insane, I muttered, half to myself. You're right, he said, his tone softer now. It is insane. But sometimes you have to take a risk to get what you really want. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice shaking. I'm talking about us, Emily, he said, closing the gap between us. You and me. Don't pretend you don't feel it too. I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Part of me wanted to run, but another part, a darker, lonelier part, wanted to stay. And then, in a moment I'll replay in my head forever, he leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was brief, but it felt like time stopped. I pulled away quickly, my hand on his chest, pushing him back. Jake, this is wrong, I said, my voice trembling. He didn't argue. Instead, he looked at me with a calm, knowing expression. Maybe it is. But tell me you haven't thought about it. Tell me you don't want more. I couldn't answer him. My silence said everything. Emily, he said, his voice low and steady, you deserve to feel alive again. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at him, my mind a blur of guilt, anger, and confusion. Eventually, I turned and left the room without saying another word. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me as I walked away. When I got home that night, Todd was exactly where I thought he'd be, on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up when I walked in. How was the party? He asked, his tone flat. Fine, I replied, forcing a smile. But it wasn't fine. Nothing was fine anymore. If you think this was the end of it, you're wrong. This was only the beginning. What happened next took me down a path I never thought I'd walk. Trust me, you'll want to hear what came after. The morning after the party, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My head throbbed, not from the wine, but from the guilt. Jake's words kept replaying in my mind. You deserve to feel alive again. What the hell was I thinking, going upstairs? I pushed the thoughts away and tried to focus on my usual Saturday routine, coffee, laundry, cleaning. Todd was still asleep, sprawled out in bed like he didn't have a care in the world. I should have felt relieved that he didn't ask more questions about the party last night, but instead, his indifference stung. It wasn't until late afternoon that I checked my phone and saw a message from Jake. "Jake, we need to talk." My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. Why was he texting me? Hadn't I made it clear by leaving that room last night? I ignored the message and buried myself in chores, hoping the buzzing in my chest would fade. But it didn't. By evening, Jake sent another message. "Jake, I can't stop thinking about last night. Can you?" I threw my phone onto the couch like it was on fire. My mind was spinning. He was testing me, baiting me to respond. And worst of all? A tiny, twisted part of me wanted to. That night, Todd was quieter than usual, which is saying a lot. We ate dinner in near silence, the clinking of forks on plates the only sound. Finally, I broke the tension. "Everything okay?" I asked. He didn't look up. "Yeah. Just tired." I wanted to scream. "Tired?" That's all he ever said. No questions about my day, no curiosity about the party, nothing. His detachment felt like a wall I'd been banging my head against for months. "Anything you want to talk about?" I pressed. "Nope," he replied, his eyes glued to his phone. I got up, took my plate to the sink, and stared out the kitchen window. My reflection in the glass looked as hollow as I felt. The next day, Jake found another way to reach me, work emails. He sent a cryptic message to my professional inbox with nothing but the subject line, "Lunch?" My pulse quickened. What was his game? Was he trying to push me into something, or was this just another power play? Either way, I knew I needed to put a stop to it. Against my better judgment, I replied, "We can't do this." His response came almost instantly, "Can't or won't." I closed my laptop, my heart pounding. This was spiraling out of control, and fast. But I didn't have time to think about it further because Todd walked in. "You've been on your laptop all morning," he said, his tone sharp. "Work stuff?" "Yeah," I lied, trying to sound casual. Todd stared at me for a moment, his eyes narrowing. It was the most attention he'd paid me in weeks, and it made me nervous. "You're acting weird," he said. "I'm fine," I snapped, a little too quickly. He didn't push it, but I could feel the tension in the air. For the first time in a long time, Todd was paying attention to me, but for all the wrong reasons. The breaking point came a few days later. I was leaving the office when Jake caught me in the parking lot. "Emily, wait," he called out, jogging to catch up. I froze. "Jake, we can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" He asked, his voice calm, like we were discussing a project deadline. "We haven't done anything. Yet." I shook my head, backing away. "This has to stop. I'm married. You're my boss." Jake stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And does he make you happy?" That question hit me like a slap to the face. I wanted to scream at him, tell him he had no right to ask me that. But the truth lodged itself in my throat, suffocating me. Did Todd make me happy? Before I could respond, Jake leaned in, so close I could feel his breath. "I'll be waiting when you're ready to admit the truth," he said, then walked away, leaving me standing there, trembling. When I got home that night, Todd was already in bed, snoring softly. I stood in the doorway, watching him sleep, and felt the weight of everything crashing down on me. My marriage, my mistakes, Jake's relentless pursuit, it was all too much. The lies were stacking up, and I knew they couldn't hold forever. Something had to give, and when it did, it wasn't going to be pretty. If you think this is where the story ends, think again. What happened next turned my world upside down in ways I never saw coming. Trust me, you'll want to hear what's coming. A week passed, but it felt like I was living in a pressure cooker. Every glance from Todd felt sharper, every text from Jake felt heavier. I'd never been so hyper-aware of my every move. I deleted Jake's messages the second they came in, rehearsed my poker face every time Todd asked how my day was, and convinced myself that I was still in control. But the truth? I wasn't. Jake wasn't letting up. Every day at work, I'd catch him watching me. It wasn't blatant, he knew how to play it just right. A lingering glance during a meeting, brushing past me in the hallway, his hand grazing mine just enough to make me second-guess everything. By Friday, I was at my breaking point. I knew I had to confront him, lay down the law once and for all. So, when Jake messaged me to meet him after work, I agreed. I told myself it was the last time. He chose a quiet wine bar just outside the city, far enough away that we wouldn't run into anyone from work. When I walked in, he was already seated in a corner booth, 2 glasses of red wine on the table. "Emily," he said, standing as I approached. His smile was warm, inviting, too inviting. "Jake, we need to talk," I said, sitting down and ignoring the wine. "Of course," he said, leaning forward. "I'm listening." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "This has to stop. Whatever this is. It's inappropriate, and it's putting both of us in a bad position." Jake didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head, studying me like I was some puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. "You're not happy, Emily," he said softly. "And you deserve to be." "That's not your call to make," I shot back, my voice firmer than I expected. "I love my husband." "Do you?" he asked, his tone cutting. "Because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look like love. It looks like convenience. Like you're settling." His words stung, but I refused to let it show. "Jake, this isn't about Todd. It's about you crossing a line, and me letting you." Jake leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You're right. I crossed a line. But don't pretend you didn't feel something when I kissed you." My face flushed. "That was a mistake," I said through gritted teeth. "Was it?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because I don't think it was. And I don't think you do either." I stood up abruptly, grabbing my purse. "This conversation is over. Don't contact me outside of work again." As I turned to leave, Jake's voice stopped me in my tracks. "Emily," he said, his tone calm but firm. "If you walk out that door, you're going to regret it." I spun around, my anger boiling over. "Are you threatening me?" Jake smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm just saying, secrets have a way of coming out. And I know you've got a few of your own." I felt the blood drain from my face. What did he know? What was he planning? "You don't scare me, Jake," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Good," he replied, lifting his glass of wine in a mock toast. "Because I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just reminding you that the truth has a funny way of revealing itself." "See you at work, Emily." The drive home was a blur. My hands shook on the steering wheel, my mind racing with possibilities. Was Jake bluffing? Or did he really have something on me? When I walked through the door, Todd was in the kitchen, making himself a sandwich. He glanced at me briefly, then went back to what he was doing. "You're home late," he said, his tone casual but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Yeah, I stayed late to finish up some reports, I lied, slipping off my coat. Todd didn't say anything, but the way he looked at me sent a chill down my spine. Was he starting to suspect something? I tried to act normal, but I felt like I was walking on eggshells. Every time Todd looked at me, I wondered if he could see the guilt written all over my face. Later that night, while Todd was in the shower, my phone buzzed with another message from Jake. Jake, think about what I said. You know where to find me. I deleted the message and threw my phone onto the bed. I wanted to scream, cry, do anything to release the pressure building inside me. But instead, I climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of fear, anger, and something else I couldn't quite name. Jake wasn't done with me, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. If you think this is as bad as it gets, trust me, it's about to get so much worse. The secrets, the lies, the betrayals, they're all about to explode. By Monday morning, I'd convinced myself I could regain control. Jake's cryptic threats and Todd's suspicious glances weren't going to shake me, I just needed to focus. Work would be my escape, my way of drowning out the chaos. But the second I stepped into the office, I knew I was wrong. Jake was waiting by my desk, leaning casually against it like he owned the place. "Morning, Emily," he said, his voice smooth and infuriatingly confident. I ignored him, setting my bag down and powering on my computer. "Busy day?" he asked, as though nothing had happened between us. "Very," I replied coldly, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But Jake wasn't one to back down. "We should go over the McAllister proposal," he said. "Conference room, 10 minutes?" It wasn't a question. Before I could argue, he walked away, leaving me fuming. 10 minutes later, I reluctantly followed him into the conference room, determined to keep things professional. But the second the door closed, Jake dropped the pretense. "Have you thought about what I said?" he asked, leaning against the table, his eyes locked on mine. "There's nothing to think about," I snapped. "Whatever this is, it ends now." Jake smirked, pushing off the table and taking a step closer. "You keep saying that, but here we are. Alone. Again. Because you cornered me." I hissed, my voice rising. Jake raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying my frustration. "You could have said no. You could have refused to meet me. But you didn't. Why is that, Emily?" "I don't have time for this," I said, turning toward the door. But before I could leave, Jake grabbed my wrist, not forcefully, but enough to stop me. "Emily, wait," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I can't stop thinking about you." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Jake, please," I whispered. "Don't do this." But instead of letting me go, he stepped closer, his hand sliding from my wrist to my shoulder. "You feel it too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wish I could say I pushed him away, that I stormed out of the room and never looked back. But I didn't. When Jake kissed me, I didn't stop him. I let it happen. And for a brief, intoxicating moment, I forgot about Todd, about the guilt, about everything. The kiss was electric, filled with a tension that had been building for weeks. It wasn't romantic, it was messy, desperate, and wrong on every level. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing keeping me from drowning. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. I pulled away, my breathing ragged, my mind racing. "This can't happen," I said, my voice shaking. "But it already did," Jake replied, his eyes burning with intensity. I backed away, my hands trembling. "I have to go," I muttered, fumbling with the door handle. The rest of the day was a blur. I couldn't focus, couldn't think. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jake's face, felt his hands on me. By the time I got home, I was a wreck. Todd was in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone as usual. "Hey," he said, glancing up briefly. "Hey," I replied, forcing a smile. "How was work?" he asked, his tone casual. "Fine," I lied, my voice unnaturally high. Todd's eyes narrowed. "You okay? You seem off." "I'm just tired," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. Todd didn't press, but I could feel his suspicion growing. He wasn't stupid, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he started asking real questions. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events in my head. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the memory of Jake's kiss. What was I doing? How had I let things spiral so far out of control? Just when I thought I couldn't feel any worse, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it quickly, terrified Todd would wake up. "Jake, I need to see you again." I stared at the message, my hands shaking. I wanted to tell him to leave me alone, to delete his number and pretend none of this had ever happened. But instead, I typed 3 words I would regret forever: when and where. If you think this was the worst decision I made, you're wrong. What happened next took everything to a level I never thought possible. Betrayal, lies, and heartbreak were just the beginning. Stay tuned, because the storm was only starting to hit. Jake didn't keep me waiting long. The next night, he suggested meeting at a small, dimly lit bar in the city. I almost said no, but something in me couldn't resist the pull of it all. Maybe it was the thrill, or maybe it was just relief that for a few hours, I could escape the suffocating reality of my life. When I walked in, Jake was already sitting at a booth, a drink in hand. He waved me over, a sly grin playing on his lips. I hesitated for just a moment before sliding into the booth across from him. "Emily," he said, raising his glass. "You came." "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Here I am." Jake took a sip of his drink and leaned forward, looking almost too casual for someone who had stirred up so much chaos in my life. "You didn't have to," he said, "but I'm glad you did." "I shouldn't have," I said, feeling a strange mix of anger and regret bubble up inside me. "Maybe not," he said, "but it felt good, didn't it? Just for a moment?" I felt a lump in my throat, the weight of what we'd done crashing down on me. "It doesn't matter," I said, my voice tinged with defiance. "Maybe it doesn't," he said, "but that doesn't change the fact that you keep coming back." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I felt cornered, guilty, and yet strangely drawn to Jake in ways I didn't understand. Just as I thought things were reaching a tipping point, the bar's door swung open, and there she was, Jessica, my méchée, storming inside like she owned the place. Her eyes locked on me, and for a second, I saw something flicker in her expression: shock, maybe, or anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" she said, cutting through the haze of my guilt and confusion. "Jessica," I said, trying to play it cool. "Don't Jessica me," she snapped, her voice loud enough to catch the attention of everyone in the bar. "What's going on, Emily?" Jake looked back and forth between us, a bemused expression on his face. "Seems like you know each other," he said, his tone almost mocking. She's my husband's ex-wife," I said, my voice tinged with embarrassment and anger. Jessica scoffed. "Yeah? And here you are, playing the same game," she said, eyeing Jake with a mixture of suspicion and rage. "Is that why you keep disappearing at night, Emily? Is this it? Some kind of pathetic revenge plot?" I wasn't, I started, but she cut me off again. Save it, she said, turning to Jake. You've been stringing her along, haven't you? Playing her like she doesn't know any better? Jake seemed unbothered, leaning back in the booth with a casual shrug. I'm just having fun, he said, looking almost too relaxed for the situation. I can't believe this, Jessica said, her eyes narrowing in on Jake. You tell me to trust you, but you're doing this garbage, behind my back? The tension in the air was electric, and for the first time, I felt like I was on the outside of a very personal drama that had nothing to do with me. The bar fell silent, and I felt the weight of all the lies and secrets in the room. Jessica turned on her heel and walked out, leaving us sitting there in stunned silence. I felt like I'd just been caught in a storm, my world spinning out of control. Jake looked unperturbed, as though this was just another obstacle to brush off. Well, he said, glancing at me with a hint of a smile that was interesting. I can't believe you, I said, my anger now bubbling over. You're just using people. You don't care about anyone. Maybe you're right, he replied, almost casually. But it doesn't change what happened between us. That's not going away anytime soon. I got up, my hands shaking, and grabbed my purse. I shouldn't have come here, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Maybe not, Jake said, but you did. And that doesn't change the fact that we both wanted it. I couldn't stand it anymore. I walked out of the bar, the chill of the night air hitting me like a bucket of ice. My head was spinning, my heart pounding. For a moment, I felt like I was losing control of everything, the lies, the betrayal, the guilt. It felt like it was all coming to a head. Back home, I felt numb, like everything inside me had frozen over. Todd wasn't home, but his absence only emphasized the void I felt inside. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television, but nothing could pull me out of the haze I was in. And as the dust settled, I couldn't help but wonder, what happens next? Will I end this, or will it get even worse from here? I never thought I'd reach a breaking point like this, but it's clear, this isn't over. It's just getting started. I didn't want to face the truth. I didn't want to confront what I'd done, the web of lies I'd been spinning. But as the days went on, it became impossible to ignore. Every conversation with Todd felt strained, every moment with Jake felt like I was pushing the limits further than I ever imagined. The guilt was suffocating, and I knew that something had to give. That something came crashing down on a Tuesday evening. Todd had been quieter than usual for days. His silence, though subtle, was the loudest thing in our house. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. I couldn't, because admitting it meant acknowledging everything I'd been doing. It meant accepting the chaos I had invited into my life. That evening, Todd didn't come home from work at his usual time. I tried calling, but his phone went straight to voicemail. My stomach twisted with anxiety. I told myself it was nothing, just a late night at the office. But deep down, I felt the familiar pang of dread that had been lingering all week. Around 9 p.m., the door slammed open, and there he was, Todd, standing in the doorway with his eyes darkened, his face hard as stone. "Where have you been?" I asked, trying to mask the panic rising in my chest. Todd didn't answer immediately. He stepped inside, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "I was talking to Jessica." My heart dropped to my stomach. What? I stammered, my voice trembling. "I know everything," Todd said, his voice low, almost eerily calm. "I know about Jake. About the messages, about the meetings. You think I'm blind? You think I don't notice you sneaking around, acting like everything's normal when it's far from it?" I froze. My world seemed to crumble around me. How long had he known? Had Jessica told him everything? Todd, I started, but he cut me off with a bitter laugh. Don't. Just don't. I should have seen it coming. He walked past me, tossing his coat onto the couch. I noticed the way you were acting. The late nights, the distance between us. I didn't want to believe it. But when I talked to Jessica, she filled in all the blanks. I felt sick, like I was going to choke on the weight of my own guilt. But as much as I hated myself for betraying him, a small part of me still wanted to defend myself. Still wanted to believe that what had happened with Jake was something that could be justified. It wasn't like that, I said, my voice barely a whisper. It was a mistake. A huge mistake, Todd. I swear. Is that what you're going to say? That it was just a mistake, he shot back, his voice rising. A mistake that you couldn't stop making? That you had to keep seeing him? That you had to keep lying to me, to yourself? I could see the hurt in his eyes. The betrayal I had caused him was written all over his face, and for the first time, I saw how much I had destroyed. I'm sorry, I whispered, feeling tears begin to sting my eyes. I never wanted to hurt you. Then why did you do it? He demanded. Why did you let this happen? Was I not enough for you? I shook my head, unable to find the words to explain the mess inside me. The guilt, the need for validation, the loneliness, none of it was an excuse, and I knew that. But in that moment, I couldn't explain it any other way. I don't know, I said finally. I don't know why I did it. I hate myself for it, Todd. But I'm sorry. He didn't respond for a long time. Instead, he just stood there, staring at me, his eyes filled with so much pain that it physically hurt to look at him. Finally, he spoke again, but this time, his voice was colder, more distant. I don't think we can fix this, he said, his words hitting me like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? I asked, panicking. Todd, please, don't do this. I can't keep living like this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't keep pretending that nothing's wrong. You broke my trust. I don't know if I can ever get it back. Not after everything. He didn't wait for me to respond. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, alone in the silence that had consumed my world. The next few days were a blur. Todd stayed out late, barely spoke to me, and spent more time at work than I'd ever seen him do before. It was clear that the damage had been done. I couldn't fix it, no matter how hard I tried. And then came the final blow. Todd came home one night with his bags packed. I think it's best if we take some time apart, he said, his face empty of any emotion. Maybe even longer than that. I don't know if I can live with this. I don't know if I want to anymore. I begged him to stay. I begged him to give me another chance to work through it. But in the end, he just shook his head, kissed me on the forehead, and walked out the door. A month later, I still didn't know where we stood. Todd had moved out. Jake had stopped messaging me, and I hadn't heard from Jessica since that night at the bar. I was alone. And for the first time, I realized what I had done. I had everything, and I threw it all away. The lies, the cheating, the thrill of the forbidden, it was all just a temporary escape. The pain, the regret, the loneliness, those were the things that lingered. Now, I had to face the consequences of my actions. And they would haunt me for the rest of my life.